The crowd roars, not for justice, not for compassion. It screams for blood, for spectacle, for the thrill of seeing bodies break. Amidst that clamor, two figures emerge. They are not warriors, they are not criminals, they are mothers, one still with fresh milk in her breasts, the other just days after childbirth. But both walk with their heads held high, without fear, as if they were not victims, but witnesses to something greater. Who were these women? And why is their story still being told 2,000 years later? I want you to imagine this. A young noblewoman, educated, wealthy, a secured future, an influential family. Her name is Vibia Perpetua. Now imagine a completely opposite woman. Her slave, her shadow. A young woman named Felicitas, whose life doesn't even belong to herself. Both women separated by a social chasm. Both women united, in the end, by the same faith and the same destiny. Stay with me, because this is not a story about religion, it's a story about courage, about love, about what it means to have a conviction so deep that nothing, not pain, not death, nor a mother's instinct can crush it. Within the damp, dark walls of the prison in Carthage, time seemed to distort. There were no nights or days, only darkness, interrupted by the screams of other condemned souls and the indifferent march of the soldiers. In that daily hell, Perpetua began to write, not on luxurious scrolls nor with noble ink, but with the trembling of an intact will. Her diary, preserved for centuries, allows us to enter not only her story, but her mind. In her first words, "There is no despair, there is clarity. They took me and separated me from my son, but the Lord strengthened me." Thus begins the voice of a woman who does not beg for pity, but for understanding. Her father, a pagan man, was the first to visit her. With tears and pleas, he begged her to recant. He offered to save her. "Renounce, daughter, for your son, for me, for our blood." But Perpetua looked him in the eyes and answered with something firmer than a refusal, with peace. The peace of one who has made an irreversible decision. Do you see this jar? Can it be called anything other than a jar? I cannot call myself anything other than Christian. That answer was not a challenge. It was a simple truth, like gravity. Her father, desperate, tore his hair, threw himself to the ground. Even the jailers were moved. She was not a daughter who hated her father. She was a daughter who loved something more than her life. Meanwhile, Felicitas remained silent. But her body spoke. Her belly grew. Her gaze hardened. The other women prayed for her, not that she would be saved, but that she could give birth before the day of execution. Felicitas, in her mind, no longer belonged to this world. She was simply waiting for the exact moment to cross the line. The days in prison were not static. They were a daily battle against illness, filth, and hunger. And yet, amid this, the prisoners sang psalms. They shared visions. One of them, Saturus, dreamed of golden stairs and tamed beasts. Another, Revocato, spoke of angels who would accompany them. And Perpetua dreamed of a dragon, a garden, and a staircase covered with weapons. Apocalyptic visions full of symbolism that fed her certainty. What they were doing was not madness. It was part of something eternal. Felicitas finally gave birth. In the tour cell, without a midwife, without help, only with her companions in faith. When the child came out of her womb, her tears were not of fear. They were of gratitude. She knew she could die alongside the others. Her daughter was secretly handed over to another Christian to be raised far from the horror. And so, the day approached. The prison was no longer a physical space, it was a spiritual training ground, a vestibule to martyrdom. They did not expect mercy, they expected glory. The night before their execution, the prisoners were invited to celebrate the Cena Libera, a last Roman banquet that the condemned could share. But the Christians did something unexpected. They turned that banquet into an impromptu Eucharist. They ate bread, drank water, and spoke of eternal life. Their faces were not of fear, they were of peace. When the guards saw this, they were perplexed. One of them asked Perpetua, "Do you really think you'll be alive tomorrow?" She replied, "Tomorrow I will be freer than ever." In the silence of that last night, there was no crying. There were embraces. There was forgiveness. There was a strange calm, as if death no longer had power over them. The morning of March 7th dawned with a thick, heavy air, as if the city itself sensed that something important was about to happen. The sun barely filtered through the columns of the amphitheater in Carthage, but the stands were already beginning to fill. Men, women, children. Some in expensive tunics, others in rags, all united by morbid curiosity, by habit, by the desire to see death. The condemned were led in procession, not hunched, not dragged. They walked with dignity. Perpetua at the front, her face serene. Felicitas behind, her feet still swollen from the recent birth. They wore no visible chains, only the invisible certainty of what awaited them. The soldiers tried to make them wear ritual garments dedicated to pagan gods, the men as priests of Saturn, the women as priestesses of Ceres. It was a mockery, another attempt at symbolic subjugation. But Perpetua refused. "We came here of our own will, we will not stoop to empty acts." The tribune, impressed by her firmness, relented. The prisoners would enter the arena as they were, and so the gates opened. The roar of the crowd grew deafening, but the women did not falter. The spectacle was carefully planned. The men were assigned different beasts, a boar, a bear, a leopard. The women a wild cow, not by chance. The cow was a symbol of the goddess Juno, protector of respectable Roman women. It was a cruel irony, a way to tarnish their identity, to mock their rebellion. They were stripped, entangled in nets, exposed. But the most touching gesture came afterward. When the cow charged at Perpetua, tossing her through the air, she fell violently to the ground, bleeding. Her torn clothes left her thigh exposed. And yet, the first thing she did was not scream in pain. She covered herself with dignity. It was not modesty. It was humanity. Even in humiliation, she retained her essence. Then, seeing Felicitas lying in the dust, she staggered to her feet and offered her hand. That gesture in the middle of the arena was a symbol more powerful than 1,000 speeches. The noble and the slave, both bloodied, both united. The crowd, used to shouting, fell silent for a moment. Some asked for them to be dressed, that these were scenes unfit even for a circus. It was one of the few times the people begged for compassion. Finally, after surviving the beasts, they were led to the gate of Santa Viberia. There, the gladiators in charge of the final execution awaited them. The executioner assigned to Perpetua was young, inexperienced, and he trembled. He raised his sword but missed the strike. The steel hit the bone of her collarbone, ripping a dry groan of pain from her. Then, in an act that defies all logic, Perpetua stood up, took the executioner's hand and guided it to her throat. As if she, not he, decided when it would all end. It was her final act, not of submission, but of absolute power over her fate. Felicitas, standing, barely supported by her companions, closed her eyes and murmured a prayer. The second blow was precise. The silence that followed was heavy, painful, unbreakable. But the story didn't end there. The news of the martyrdom spread through North Africa like wildfire. It wasn't seen as a defeat, but as a proclamation. Faith did not bend, not even before Rome. St. Augustine, born in the same land 2 centuries later, would recognize in them the root of a transformation. He would preach their example, honor their memory. Christian communities began to grow, not out of hatred, but out of inspiration, because 2 women, without weapons, without armies, had defied the most powerful empire in the world and made it tremble. Not with violence, but with dignity. And while emperors continued to build statues, temples, conquests, the memory of Perpetua and Felicitas became a seed, a symbol, a spiritual revolution. The blood that stained the sands of Carthage was not absorbed by the dust of oblivion. On the contrary, it became ink, word, living memory. What Perpetua and Felicitas did that day didn't end with their death. It began there. Because their testimony, preserved through the centuries, wasn't just read. It was felt, repeated, venerated. In the years following their martyrdom, their story began to circulate among the first Christian communities, not as a legend, but as a tangible account, written by the very hand of one of them. That authenticity gave it an unusual power. She was not an apostle, She was not an evangelist, she was not a church father. She was a young woman, a mother, a martyr, who spoke with her own voice. The text of the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas became one of the most copied and shared documents in early Christianity. Translated into Greek, reproduced in manuscripts for centuries, it inspired thousands of believers who lived under the constant threat of persecution. It was more than a text, it was a flame. Saint Augustine, one of Christianity's greatest thinkers, born in the same land as them, recognized their legacy. Each year, on March 7th, he preached a sermon in their honor, not out of liturgical obligation, but because he understood that what they did had challenged even the foundations of Roman culture. In his words, they were an example of virtue not only for women but for the whole church. The account also became a model for writing other martyr lives. It was imitated, reproduced, adapted. Its structure, with visions, dialogue, family, confrontations, and spiritual triumph over physical violence, became the literary mold for Christian hagiography. Every story of saints and martyrs that followed owes something to them. But the impact didn't stop at early Christianity. Over the centuries, theologians, philosophers, feminists, historians, and artists found in Perpetua and Felicitas a symbol that transcended religion. The noble and the slave, united equal. In a deeply hierarchical social system where a woman couldn't even testify legally, their example was a radical break with the established order. In the Middle Ages, their relics were venerated. Churches were consecrated in their name. Nuns copied their story by hand. During the Renaissance, writers reclaimed them as a symbol of feminine virtue. In modern times, their story has been cited in debates about human rights, gender equality, and freedom of conscience. Even today, in the 21st century, in a radically different world, their names still resonate. In contexts where women are still silenced, where faith becomes a cause for persecution, where the powerful still crush the weak, the story of Perpetua and Felicitas once again makes sense, because it reminds us of something essential, that dignity doesn't depend on status, that courage is not the monopoly of soldiers, that the strongest testimony is not shouted, it is lived. Two women, alone facing the machinery of the most brutal empire in history, decided not to betray their faith, not out of ignorance, not out of fanaticism, but out of certainty, out of love for something that the power of Rome could neither understand nor destroy. That is their victory, not death, but the life they inspired afterward. And now, if you made it this far, if you felt the tremor of these words, I ask you not to let them fall into the void. Share this story. Write in the comments what part moved you the most. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this. Forgotten stories. Stories that deserve to be told again. Because if Rome built an empire of stone, Perpetua and Felicitas built something more powerful, a legacy of fire. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.